Mostly True Ghostly Stories by Natasha Rosewood. Ghostly is a collection of 10 spooky, fictionalized tales inspired by the real-life experiences of ex-flight attendant, psychic and author Natasha J. Rosewood. Whether set in a haunted youth hostel in France, a ghost town in Death Valley, California, at 35,000 feet over the Alps, or the alien-invaded English countryside, every story will have you teetering on the edge of the abyss between reality and illusion. Chapter 1. Breathe. "What is that?" I asked David as we drove past the towering expanse of a satellite dish overwhelming a large field. "Oh, that's Jodrell Bank," he explained. "I'm not sure, but I think they monitor what's happening in outer space. Some people believe that it's the reason why we attract so many UFOs around here." UFOs? I was skeptical. Not that I didn't believe in UFOs. I did. But I was new to the area, and David, my boyfriend of just 2 months, was known for his practical jokes, as well as an endearing stutter and a wicked sense of humour. "I'm serious." He gave me his serious look. "A couple of years ago, people driving through the hills near here reported that their car engines suddenly died and their car radios went on the blink. Then, lo and behold, some flying saucer appeared." David switched to his Alfred Hitchcock voice. "Not many people believed them, of course. Not until a UFO made a star appearance over Macclesfield in full daylight. At least 10,000 people saw this noiseless round disc appear with its pulsating orange lights and then disappear and reappear again. All those people couldn't be crazy, or could they?" "Very funny," I retorted. And he was. That's what had attracted me to David, that he could make me smile, and the fact that he was tall and gentle and emanated a kind of inner strength. "Have you seen any UFOs?" "Not yet, but I keep looking," he grinned. On Wednesday, May 17th, 1968, life was good. I was 17, free of any immediate pressure to study, and I was in love. On this rare, clear, blue-skied evening, David wanted to take me for a drive up to the Pennines to show off his newly acquired second-hand grey Humber. "It's very comfortable," I commented as we drove. Though the car's plump seats were all cracked with age, the interior still smelled of leather. He seemed pleased that I approved. Around us, the Cheshire countryside appeared serene in the golden light of summer. Sheep and their lambs grazed in the fields. In the distance, the land rose up into a wall of dark green hills, and a soft pink haze drifted over the horizon. We drove on through the small mill town of Bollington, and then found our way onto a narrow country lane, rising up and up, winding through the village of Pottage Hill. Soon we were in the Pennines, following the meandering road that cut a line between the upper side of the slopes and the lower fields as they rolled downward. David suddenly pulled over to the left, parking the car in what seemed like a well-used spot. "Let's go and take a look at the view," he urged, jumping out of the car. He grabbed my hand and pulled me across the road to look down the hillside. In the encroaching darkness, as we stood before a low, dilapidated stone wall, we were just able to make out the shadowy outlines of villages, now clusters of glistening orange and yellow lights, snuggled each into their own hollows. David suddenly turned around to face up the slope on the other side of the road. "Oh, look," he said, pointing to something beyond the spot where he had parked his car. "Looks like an old cottage built onto the hill." I swiveled and peered into the shadows to see what took his interest. "Come on." David took my arm, pulling me across the narrow country lane. "Let's go see." I saw what had been a dwelling sheltered in the lee of the hill. The roof was completely gone, and the stones that made up the walls remained precariously balanced one on top of the other. "I think this is a miner's cottage, and that," David said, pointing to the right, "must be the quarry." I followed his focus. Or was, I corrected. What, in the old days, must have been the mining site was now just a flattish, grassy area enclosed in a semicircular wall of undergrowth. The dimension of an undersized football field, black patches of trees, bushes, and other tangled plant life hung down, as if bending over to listen to something, or as if crushed by some great weight. A 2-stringed barbed wire fence was loosely strung across the front of the area. "What do you think that is?" David was pointing far into the belly of the quarry. A vague shape, dark and metallic, was barely visible in the growing dark. "A dead robot?" I offered, laughing. "I don't know. An old car?" "I want to see." David grinned at me mischievously. I hesitated. The quarry was darkening rapidly, the greens turning to varying shades of black. As we stood in front of the pit, I was reminded of a huge gaping mouth, as though a dinosaur had taken a large bite out of the hillside, leaving just this murky, cavernous hole. "Let's go in," he said, grabbing my hand and pulling me forward. David held the top line of barbed wire high for me while I carefully pulled myself through. Then deftly he did the same. We hadn't walked far when I heard a noise. I stopped to listen, peering upward into shadows. "What is that?" I turned to David, but he was already bounding ahead of me in the direction of the pit. Someone or something was breathing, but it was too loud for a someone. It had to be a something. Where was the noise coming from? Could a huge animal be crouching in the trees? Was the breathing coming from up there on the right toward the top of the quarry? No, not specifically anyway. The whole hillside appeared to be heaving. The noise was getting louder and louder. I spun around. The breathing was coming from everywhere now. The trees, the grass, the quarry wall. The whole area was pulsating, heaving with breath. I swiveled in David's direction. He wasn't there. I opened my mouth to scream, but nothing came out. Then all around the sound of breathing ceased. A strange, thick silence rang in my ears. I was paralyzed, trapped in it, as if time had come to a halt. Or was it sheer terror? Then suddenly the silence was gone. The air lightened and cleared. Then the breathing began again, this time overwhelming, deafening. I had to get away. I spun, terrified, and lurched into a sprint back toward the road. "Just get through the fence," I told myself. "It's not far." The ground was clumpy beneath my feet, and my shoes weren't made for running. The pounding in my ears couldn't drown out the breathing that was closing in around me, threatening to swallowing me up. "Please, God, get me out of here," I rasped as I reached the fence. I bent down, one leg through, bring the other through. "I've made it," I thought. But then I was jerked backward as the hood of my jacket caught on the fence, holding me captive between 2 lethal strands of barbed wire, forcing me to stare downward at the ground. A panicked sob escaped from my throat. I thrashed from side to side, attempting to unhook myself, but it wasn't letting me go. Then I sensed someone standing over me. Suddenly freed, I could straighten up. David, his tall form barely recognizable in the shadows, was planted there, motionless. "Thanks a lot for waiting for me," I hissed, both relief and anger spewing out of me. "Come on," he urged. "Into the car." He was right. We didn't have time for recriminations. We both scrambled into the Humber. I banged down the stiff button lock on my door. David fumbled as he hurriedly tried to insert the key into the ignition. Even in the darkness, I knew his hand was shaking. "Hurry up," I whispered loudly. "I'm trying," he snapped. I stared into the quarry, half hoping, half terrified, that whatever it was would make itself visible, but only a still black void stared back at me. Finally David found the ignition. The car groaned and choked. "Oh no, what if this thing had control of the car?" He muttered something and turned the key again. The car coughed and sputtered, and then, oh joy, the engine hummed. David crunched the gear stick into reverse and banged his foot on the pedal, nearly backing into the fence. The tires squealed as he turned the big car sharply on the road and accelerated back toward Pottage Hill. The high beams illuminated only hedgerows as we sped down the otherwise black lane. The road was only wide enough for a single car, and David was driving too fast for the narrow space, but I didn't want him to slow down. Until we saw the familiar lights of the village, we didn't speak or exhale. Now, with a reasonable distance between the quarry and us, I glanced over at David. His face broke into a grin, and I giggled. "Let's go for a drink," I suggested, laughing, but still shaking. "Good idea." We pulled into the Lamb's Inn, perched on a steep rise of a hill on the village outskirts. Its brightly lit alcoves were decorated with antique knickknacks, displayed on yellow tobacco-stained walls. The place was empty, except for two young businessmen who leaned against the bar, chatting while fixated on a television suspended above the bar. An oddity for a pub, I thought, but now that we were around people and lights and normality, I breathed deeply. "What'll it be, then?" the rotund barman asked David. "2 ciders, please." I found a seat in the corner, and pulling my jacket around my shoulders, I huddled on the hard wooden bench. I could still hear the sound of that breathing. I shuddered. What on earth could it have been? David brought 2 small tankards over to our table and sat down. He grinned. "Get it down, ye," he said, raising his glass to mine, as they say around here. "David, what do you think that thing was?" "I don't know, but it was big." "It sounded like the whole quarry was breathing." The barman started gathering up used glasses from the tables near us, emptying ashtrays and wiping the wood surfaces with a frayed rag. A vague angst began to settle over me like a dark cloud. Strange, I thought. David hasn't stuttered since we left the quarry. "And by the way, was that your idea of a joke?" I sniped, "leaving me like that?" David's glass banged down on the table. "I wasn't playing a joke on you, Sarah." His face flushed a deep pink. "I looked for you, and I couldn't see you. I thought you had left me." "But I was standing right there in the middle of the quarry." The barman was hovering. "You're not from here, are you?" he asked, addressing David. "No, Brighton. My boyfriend had only been in the north for a few years longer than I had." "Oh, aye." The man was standing over us now. "Well, I hope you're not thinking about going up into those hills tonight." David sputtered on his drink. "Strange things have happened up there about this time of year, I can tell 'ee." Now he sounded like Alfred Hitchcock. "Really?" I peered up at him. "Oh, aye." He sat down at the table opposite, wheezing slightly. "Like what?" David asked. I glanced at my boyfriend's features. Maybe it was just the harsh yellow lights of the pub, but he looked different somehow, paler, drawn, and he still hadn't stuttered. Who was he, really? Coward, trickster, or innocent? "Things that really can't be explained," the barman was saying, turning to peer out of the window into the night. "Can you tell us?" I asked. "Aye, but you might not believe in me." "Tell us anyway, please," I urged. He scratched his chin. "Well, there were one young couple. Came in early evening, about this time of year." David and I leaned in closer. "Well, they looked, like a nice pair. Americans. Said they were travelling around country. Then the strangest thing happened. They asked me how long it would take them to get from here to Bangor in North Wales, because they had to be there by Wednesday lunchtime. Well, I said, you're going to be a bit late, aren't you? Today's Wednesday." The barman sat forward, the buttons on his thin cotton shirt straining. "Now, I know we can all get our days mixed up. I do it all the time." So I said, "You've just got a bit confused, that's all." Well, she gave me a look that would have skinned a cow. So did he. "That's not possible," he said. "I know that when we left Yorkshire this morning it was Tuesday. I still have the paper I bought at the hotel before we left." The man shifted his weight on the bench. "And blow me down if he didn't plunk it on the table to show it to me. Yesterday's Telegraph. Tuesday, it said. He wouldn't lie about something like that now, would he?" I leaned back against the wall. A trembling had started somewhere in my body. "I'm not here to argue," I said. The bartender continued. but I'll get my paper. I showed him the Sun. There it were in bold print, Wednesday, May 11th, 1967. Somehow they'd lost a day. He shook his head at the memory. Do you know if they ever found out what happened? I asked quietly. The trembling had progressed to my legs now. Oh, aye. The lady rang me up just before she went back to America. He stroked his rough chin. Said she couldn't tell me all the story of it. She wanted me to promise that I would warn people not to go into Quarry. Why? The question came out of my mouth involuntarily. Well, for the rest of their trip, she said, her husband acted really strange like. So strange that she was afraid to be with him. Told me she'd left him and she was going back to America on her own. His bulbous eyes rested on David. Apparently, they decided to take a detour on their journey and stopped at Quarry just up road. Do you know old Quarry? David barely nodded. Just at my view, she said, when they heard this strange noise, like breathing. The barman went on, oblivious to the fact that my whole body was now quivering. And when they were there, her husband disappeared. I sat up straight, pulling my jacket tight around me. For a while, anyways. Just like David. And that night she found some red marks on his neck that weren't there before. He pointed a chubby finger to a place behind his shirt collar. What do you think happened to them? David asked softly. The barman took a deep breath and scrutinized both of us. Well, I denied if anybody asked, but I think they were used for experiments. Experiments? I blurted. For what? A scraping noise came from the front of the pub. 2 elderly gentlemen had come in, pulled stools out, and parked themselves at the bar. Suddenly grinning, he said, Oh, better get back to work. Instantly reverting to his role as bartender, he pulled his bulk off the bench, but before he moved away from our table, he turned and said, Oh, by the way, a few days after being in Quarry, she found out she was pregnant. So? David's tone was more defensive than cynical. Not unusual, but she'd always been told by doctors it were impossible for her to have children. We both watched him as he shuffled back to his position behind the bar. I shivered and pulled my jacket even tighter around me. David was staring into his drink. A roar of laughter came from the front of the pub. Suddenly, I didn't feel comfortable being alone with my boyfriend. Shall we go and watch TV? David shrugged and stood up. Taking our almost empty glasses, we walked over to join the regulars at the bar. Several stools were vacant at one end. Another round? The barman asked, polishing a wineglass. David nodded. A comedy had just ended. Now the news was on. I wasn't really paying much attention to the stiff newscaster, Reginald Bosanquet. Familiar images appeared of shell-shocked children in Ireland, tanks rolling through Israel, ongoing apartheid violence in South Africa. But they didn't register. Something was odd, though. Maybe it was just the uncommon act of watching television in a pub. Our ciders appeared and we drank in silence. Then the announcer on the television said something. His words made me freeze. When did he say Martin Luther King died? I turned to David. He was frowning. Last year. We listened again. Now Reginald was talking about Apollo 2 landing on the moon in July, just 2 months away. But I thought they weren't going up till next year. I was aware that my voice was rising. Breathe, I told myself. You're a bit out of touch, aren't you, Chuck? The barman was pulling a pint. They have to put a man up moon this year, just like Mr. Kennedy had promised, before the end of the decade. David and I stared at each other. Nothing made sense. The news was ending. Reginald was shuffling papers and signing off. And that's the end of the 9 o'clock news for today, May 17th, 1969. I inhaled sharply. David let his tankard slam down on the bar. But today is... My eyes scanned the wall behind the bar, desperately searching for a calendar. I frowned at David. Why hadn't I noticed that red mark on his neck, just visible above the collar of his pink shirt? And how come he still hadn't stuttered? The paralyzing fear that made my stomach clench was validated by his answer. Supposed to be May 17th, 1968, he said softly, finishing my sentence. As he turned to look at me, The gentleness in his eyes had been replaced by a cold, emotionless stare. When his hand grasped mine and he said, "We should go now," I realized that the person who would be driving me home was someone or something I didn't know at all.